Good afternoon and welcome back. Get yourself a nice cup of tea and relax because we are once more travelling back in time to 1859 where Paul Morphy is commentating on the 1834 game between Bourdonnais and McDonnell. And of course there are no known photographs of Alexander McDonnell, so we've got Father Dougal standing in for him and standing in for Bourdonnais because I've only found drawings of Bourdonnais. We have Zero Mostel. And the state of play so far is that we've had two games. And in both games, McDonnell was winning for most of the time, but managed in the end to throw both games away for draws. So this is the third match. Let's see if McDonnell can finally manage to hold on to a victory. So we have Bourdonnais start with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4. McDonnell captures straight away, bishop to c4, queen to f6, castles this time, d6 from McDonnell, c3, and again McDonnell pushing to d3, and again Bourdonnais captures with the queen, queen to g6, bishop to f4, bishop to e7, knight on b to d2, and knight to h6. And Morphy commentates here, the position previous to Black's ninth move is the same as in the preceding contest. In commenting on that game, we indicated the line of play here adopted by McDonnell as the best at his command. That sort of sounds like maybe a backhanded comment, but we'll let it slide. So the game continues. Bourdonnais rook on knight to h6 first, and then rook on a to e1. Black castles, knight to d4. And McDonnell brings his knight up to e5, bishop captures, the pawn captures, knight on 4 to f3 to escape the pawn here, bishop to d6, and then we have h3. And I've marked in this arrow here because Paul Morphy wants us to consider this capture. The move that McDonnell actually played here was h8. And Morphy says, king to h8 was with the intention of throwing forward his f-pawn. Curiously enough, the apparently fatal step of bishop captures h3 was the correct play at this juncture and would have resulted in a decided advantage to black. So suppose that bishop captures h3, then knight to h4, queen to g5, then if white takes the bishop with the queen, Black would capture the queen's knight and remain with a clear pawn advantage. So if we count all the pawns here, Black has 7 and White has 6, so indeed Morphy's right. Black does indeed remain with a clear pawn. So if we go back to here, if instead knight on d to f3, we may have queen to g4 and king to h1, bishop to e7. And Morphy notes that Black, instead of bishop to e7, Black might first play rook on a to d8 with still greater advantage. And I think because he means that he can reveal an attack on the queen. But the line that he wants us to concentrate on is bishop to e7. And he says, whatever course now White chooses to adopt, Black must remain with a pawn more. So, if knight captures the pawn on e5, then we have bishop captures on g2 with check. Knight captures on g2 because it's check. And then queen to h5, again with check. So king to g1, and the queen recaptures the knight on e5. And Black ought to win, says Morphy, because he's still a pawn up. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And at this point, Paul Morphy references a publication called the Chess Players Chronicle. He says, the first volume of the Chess Players Chronicle gives the following variations, which are also correct. And we'll start these from king to h1, g5, knight captures on g5, bishop captures g2 again with check, knight recaptures the bishop, and king takes the knight on g5. And again, black has the advantage of a pawn, so he's got 6, and he's playing against 5, and the king looks quite exposed down the h file here. Again, from the Chess Player's Chronicle, if king to h2 in this position, then black to play knight f5, and Morphy says black must preserve the pawn gained. And so I had a look at this, and I found that you might think about capturing the knight here, but if you do that, McDonnell would simply push the pawn here, revealing a check and forking the queen and the knight. So white's best move here would be to capture the bishop, but then he loses the queen, and it's basically all over. If instead the knight captures on f5, then of course it's instant checkmate, so that's also bad for white, good for black. So going back to king to h2, if bishop to e7, then we could do this g captures on h3 move. In this case, black queen can go to f4 with check. The king moves, and then the bishop takes the horse. And white can capture back, but again, McDonnell is up a pawn. Okay, we're coming to the end of these variations now. If we had king to h2, bishop to e7, and then knight captures e5, queen captures the knight, then if queen recaptures the bishop, then again we have a check from the queen on h4, labourdonnais blocks, and the queen can pick up the horse, and then we have a queen exchange because there's a fork here. So the king has to move, and then again, this time Morphy says McDonnell would win easily because he's up a whole piece. There are 6 pawns each, but he's up a clear knight here. And the final variation, if I can find it again, would have been, instead of the queen capturing this bishop, for the pawn to capture. And then the line is bishop to d6, pinning the knight, f4, bishop captures the knight, the pawn captures back, knight to g4 with check, king to g1, and knight takes the pawn. And Morphy said black must win here, and what he's doing here is he's forking the bishop and the queen, so you'll expect the queen to move somewhere, the bishop to get taken, and then probably the pawn here will fall. So in this variation, McDonnell's actually up 2 pawns. Alright, so after all of that, instead of capturing the pawn, of course McDonnell went to h8, he decided not to win once more, and the game continues. Knight to h4, queen to h5, queen to g3, f5 from McDonnell, knight takes f5, knight takes f5, e takes f5, bishop takes f5, knight to e4, bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, rook to f6. It's probably trying to double up the bishops here. Labourdonnais plays h4, attacking the queen, rook to h4, attacking the queen. Queen comes across to f5, queen to e3, queen back to d7, bishop to d3. We've got 2 pieces attacking this h7 pawn now, and McDonnell blocks with g6, and we have bishop to e4, rook to f8, queen to g3, queen to g7, and b4 from Labourdonnais. Here, Morphy comments, White's efforts for the next 4 or 5 moves are directed to prevent black from occupying with his bishop the diagonal of the white f-pawn, while black is equally earnest in his endeavours to obtain possession of it. So he's talking about this diagonal. He's saying that Labourdonnais wants to stop the black bishop coming to this square, and black really wants to come to this square. So we see a5 from McDonnell, attacking the b4 pawn, and Labourdonnais backs it up with a3, captures, and McDonnell pushes c5. Rook to b1, giving more support to this pawn, captures, and the bishop retreats to c7. King to h1, and now what McDonnell played here was rook to b6, but he could have played rook captures on f2. But what does Morphy think about this? Morphy says rook captures f2 looks promising, but we doubt whether black by that mode of play could obtain more than a drawn game. So if the bishop captures here, this would evidently be bad, as black would check with the rook, like so, and then advance the e-pawn. So it would be an exchange here, the king moves out of the way, and now we've got an open file for the black pawn to get through and queen. So capturing with the bishop here is no good, so with the queen, Morphy says this is best. And then rook to f1 check, the king moves out the way, and we have a queen exchange, and black can't take this bishop because the pawn is pinned by the rook, and the pawn starts getting pushed. This comes with check, by the way. So g3, and Morphy says black draws, and he says we can discover no course leading to a more favourable result. We think therefore that McDonnell, having rather the better game, acted wisely in rejecting the move rook takes f2. Rook takes f2. Morphy says this was good that McDonnell rejected it and went somewhere else. So McDonnell went to b6. The play selected instead is the commencement of a highly ingenious combination by which he gained a fine attack. So the game continues, b5, bishop to d8, rook to g4, g5, bishop to f3, h5, so the rook's under attack here, rook to e4, g4, and Labourdonnais played captures here. But Morphy says it surely would have been more prudent to retreat the bishop to e2. By taking the pawn, he opened his king to an attack which ought to have legitimately resulted in a victory for black. So in the actual game, Labourdonnais captured, McDonnell captures back, and the queen recaptures the pawn, and we have rook to h6 by McDonnell with check. So the king moves back to g1, queen to h7, g3, rook to g8, queen to c8, bishop to b6, queen to c3, rook captures the pawn on g3 with check, and of course this pawn is pinned by this bishop, which is what McDonnell was trying to get earlier on, and so the king has to move aside. Bishop to d4, queen to c8 with check, rook to g8 blocking it and threatening the queen, so the queen moves to c4, and right here Morphy says, as previous commentators have truly remarked, black might now have easily won by rook to h2. So how does that work? Well, if rook to h2, then the Bourdonnais doesn't want this move to happen. It'll be check, and all sorts of danger happens with the queen. So he has to eliminate the bishop, and of course this reveals the attack on the b1 pawn, which comes with check. King moves aside, the pawn captures the rook, and the pawn is captured with check. And now the rook blocks, and it's clear by this point that black is up a rook and an exchange. He's got 2 rooks for a bishop, and you will expect black to easily win, as Morphy says. So if we go back to another winning opportunity here that McDonnell missed, what he actually played was rook to h1 with check. So the king moves out the way, the rook captures on b1, the rook takes the bishop on d4, and Morphy commentates here, it is quite evident that if the e captures the rook, if the e pawn captures the rook, white could have drawn by perpetual check. So we'll just see this in action. The queen takes the pawn with check, blocks, check, blocks, check, blocks with the rook, check, blocks, check, blocks, check, blocks, check, and you can see it's just it'll be check forever until they agree to a draw. So we'll go back to that move that didn't happen, and what actually happened was rook to b2, and then Bourdonnais blocks, rook captures, so that's a rook exchange, and then rook to d8 with check, king to e2, queen to h6, queen to c3, queen to g7, bishop to e4, king to g8, queen to b3 with check, king to f8, queen to f3 with check, queen to f7, and bishop takes b7, and it's a queen exchange on f3. And at this point the players agreed to a draw. So why is it a draw? Well, if we just play the next few potential moves, then we'll see that this pawn and this bishop are combined on the B and C files here, and black can't do anything about them. White will just be able to keep moving his bishop up and down this diagonal, and if ever black decides to want to take one of them, well, he'll lose his rook doing it, and he'll be left with 1 pawn against 1 pawn, so drawn game. Well, that's it for today from me. Once more, McDonnell threw away a winning position, so that's 3 in a row, 3 draws in a row. Join me again next time, and we'll see if he can manage to bring home a win in the 4th game. See you then.